Thank you for that typical introduction, typically mischievous. It is good to be, and it is particularly good to be here, because I remember when you launched the campaign for social science, you launched it over at the House of Commons as a kind of challenge to us. And we in BIS, as part of the science and research base, we absolutely understand the importance of social science. It's great that this time you've come here within BIS to have the latest meeting of the campaign for social science. And within the £4.6 billion ring fence for science, of course, the definition of science is actually all of the research activities that our research institutes and universities carry out. And within that, we have maintained the broad balance, and of course we therefore fund the ESRC and the AHRC, just like all the other disciplines. So we do understand the importance of social science, and I sometimes detect a kind of defensiveness or insecurity in some people. Particularly, I think it is a problem with the humanities, but on the social science as well. I just say this is one of the great advantages, one of the great strengths we have in Britain, is that even though we're only a medium-sized economy, whenever the external assessors look at our research activity, it is very broad-based, and I would say we have the widest range of different areas of research excellence for any medium-sized economy, and one of my aims is absolutely to maintain that. I think it would be a tragedy if any British minister in any government was forced to say, you know, we can afford the physics but not the social science, or we're going to do the climate change but we're going to give up on the biological sciences. And especially nowadays when connectivity matters and interdisciplinary activity matters, it's even more important that we keep all the different activities. And so, yeah, we're very comfortable with the case for social sciences. There are 2 or 3 particular initiatives that you'll all be familiar with that are particularly relevant for longitudinal work. First, of course, we were able to fund the 2012 birth cohort study, and it's very important that we maintain that kind of canonical succession going back to 1946. One regrettable interruption at one point, but other than that, we have pretty much maintained them. And the 2012 study is going to be the one that I think most ambitiously links some of the medical and biological and indeed genetic data with also social and environmental data. And of course, as well as investing in the 2012 study, we've also invested in the infrastructure and the work we need to make better connections between that and previous studies and enrich previous studies. And I remember Polly, at the time we did it, I remember Polly welcoming it. She went on to welcome it because it would enable her to track the damage done by the coalition's policies as she saw it. So that was a slight sort of sting in the tail, but nevertheless she did welcome it. So that is, I think, it's a recognition that not only do we maintain the balance of current spending across the different disciplines, when there are important areas of capital expenditure, the social sciences capital cost should also be reflected as part of our capital investments in scientific research. So that's the first thing. I mean, secondly, we are still considering this very useful report from the Administrative Data Task Force, which came out in December of last year. And it's one of the best pieces of work I've seen just on how you might link administrative data. And it also tackles very clearly some of the practical problems you face in this area. Rather different policy regimes in the devolved administration, so the suggestion that you needed kind of centres in each one of the component parts of the United Kingdom, and also the recognition that we really had to have very high standards of confidentiality for individuals whose data was being used. And we have not yet quite got to sort of the official government response to it, but all I can say today is we're looking on it very favourably, and of course that itself brought with it some requests for further public spending on the Administrative Data Task Force, and again negotiations are very lively at the moment, but I very much hope we're able to find funding for the investment in some of the proposals in that report as well. So that was the second thing. Thirdly on my list was that I chair what we call the Social Mobility Transparency Board, and what that's really about is improving in practical terms the data linking between so many different agencies. And there are, when you really dig down into it, there are difficulties in linking schools data, FE data, HE data, employment data. And there are people I see in this room who have worked heroically trying to make these connections, and sometimes the legal regime and the administrative permissions are very onerous. And we're trying, through bringing together the different departments in our Social Mobility Transparency Board, to try to tackle some of those problems, though some of them might require, ultimately, we think, some changes in the legislative framework as we look at this slightly quirky area where in some areas it looks as if sharing of data is just legally very difficult, in other areas it looks like more possible. So I think those are three practical examples: the birth cohort study, the Administrative Data Task Force, what we're doing in the Social Mobility Transparency Board, where we are trying to back and support the work that you're doing in your commitment to research in longitudinal studies, but I'm sure there's more we should be doing. And if there are any, in just a few minutes, if people have any comments or suggestions or questions, be very interested to hear from you.
Thank you, David. Can we open it up now, and can you say who you are and who you represent? Woody?
It's Woody Cobb, David. It's really great for you to be here. This is a question I initially posed to David Freud in the Department of Retentions. But it strikes me that one thing, with all this wonderful skills in longitudinal studies, that as a collective, the Academy is perhaps not so good at, is thinking proactively. And the example that I raised with retentions was demobilizing veterans and the outcomes of their varied experiences and backgrounds. And the Institute of Military Medicine have also been asking for that, because it appears, anecdotally, that many of the returning veterans do very badly in civilian life. And we ought to be able to anticipate their needs. What do you feel about designing future longitudinal studies to be more proactive?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting angle that hadn't been put to me before, but of course, when you say design them to be proactive, I'm not quite, you know what I mean, the resource that we have in these studies, like the 2012 study, I'm sure people in 50 years' time will be harnessing this data in ways that we can't imagine now. And the main thing is for us just to collect it and make it accessible and usable, and then properly preserve it. So we can't, we know none of us aims to be able to predict everything. It's just to collect data that other people can then use. And part of your ingenuity, the people in this room, is ingenuity in the designing of social science experiments, drawing on the data that is available. But that's a suggestion instead for a particular survey now, and I think it's a very, very interesting one, and I think we ought to try to discuss it with the MOD.
Yeah, well, could I just add to that, David? One of the sources, of course, is military records going... Sorry.
You say who you are as well.
John Bunner, sorry, Institute of Education. No, it just struck me, I mean, these questions stimulated me to think, because it came up on my agenda not so long ago, that there is a huge potential in military records that can be linked, of course, to all the birth cohort studies. The parents of the babies, for example, were in the Second World War, and therefore participating in that, and therefore coming out of it could be studied through these cohort studies. But I'd like to link back to your own interest personally in work with these sorts of data sets. How do you think they should be opened out in new directions that maybe we weren't looked in the past?
I think it has been hard for them. Well, my impression as a layman is, first, they haven't always themselves been linked up. So tracing the story and analysing in a similar way the 48, 58, 70 data has not been straightforward. I have to think, I think sometimes the community itself, you as representatives of the community, have invested a lot of weight. I mean, someone said, comparing the 58 and 70 birth cohort studies on social mobility, 2 points doesn't make a trend, and some of the weight that's attached to those perhaps goes beyond what the data will bear. And there's also been a sense in the past that different cohort studies belong to different disciplines. The 46 one was very medical. We are, and I think some of the areas where we're also trying to invest resource is trying to get the medics, the social scientists, the economists all sharing data and recognising they've all got value they can extract from it. So breaking down disciplinary boundaries is also, I think, would be very important, and I think that's probably an area where we're now making progress.
Yes.
Curtis Wales. Curtis Wales from that sense. We collect the Understanding Society data as a panel rather than a cohort survey. And when we do research with participants, the main thing they say is they want to see more use of the survey. So when you go and sit in some of these homes and see them take part, they have this belief that it's really making an impact. And I wonder whether you think we should do more to communicate that impact to participants, or what the role the participants can actually play in this debate that we're having today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. How it, and you do have, and of course NatSen does, very useful publications, pamphlets that even, and newsletters that even busy ministers can look at that give a sense of some of the findings that are emerging from research that you do, and that's worth wide distribution. Some of the impact, people can, some of these surveys, some of this empirical research certainly does have an impact. I mean, I remember still how, because of when our first child and second child was born, the doctrine changed. It was the baby sleeping on its front or its back. I'm trying to remember which way around it was. But what I can remember is we got absolutely strict instructions for the second baby, which were the opposite of the ones that we had from the first baby. And so those are examples where people go off and do some research, and it looks just like the health visitor telling you what to do, but actually it's based on serious empirical work. It's so far back as I say, I can't remember. But those kind of lessons are applied.
Yes, is there an opportunity, Anne Buchanan from Oxford, is there an opportunity really to get wonderful? I was recently in China and they were developing their own longitudinal data set of all children. And there's a wonderful possibility, and I think I linked them with the Evers Institute, but wonderful opportunity to really get data about children in particular, which is a natural experiment because they've actually had very different upbringing. We can learn an awful lot. And I'm not sure what movement there is on this. Is there any movement?
There are. I mean, certainly Chinese people do come over. They're very interested in our longitudinal work. They regard us as people from whom they can learn in the construction of those things. There are interesting natural experiments by all the classics like twins that are separated or people having different experiences. Of course, also sometimes, as with the rise of the randomised control trial, you also have quite interesting ethical issues. I remember when we brought in the HE fees regime, of course not fees that students pay up front, so make no point, that there was anxiety whether people would put off going to university. However, it was based on a misunderstanding. Nevertheless, we just put them on. And we set up we organised a graduate finance tour, which would go around all the schools and colleges explaining the realities of the system. And the high-minded advocates of randomised control trials said to me, please could your graduate finance tour not visit 250 schools and colleges so we can measure the effect of not having this information as against having information. And we had a sort of semi-serious discussion. I said, look, I'm going to stand up in the House of Commons and explain why we took a deliberate decision that 250 schools and colleges shouldn't get this service. And they withdrew. They recognised that in terms of the wider public policy and the policy, it wouldn't have been acceptable, I think, for me to have said we're going to withhold this service from 250 education institutions just to measure the effects. So there are, when the political pressures come in, some of these experiments can be quite hard to do in practice.
Hi, I'm Nicola Shelton from University College London. What I'd like government to do better is communicate what it wants to know. What are the questions that government wants the academic community to address?
Right, I would say, I mean, partly because of chairing this Social Mobility Transparency Board and also the sitting on the Deputy Prime Minister's overall policy group, that the one area, by no means the only, but one area, it is incredibly... I do think the debate has been excessively influenced by the 58 and 70 cohort studies and comparing the findings from those two cohorts. And we could have a much richer debate based on tracing people through the system. And to my mind, and I know this is a crude question, but we're very bad at answering the question, how much social mobility do you buy for different interventions at different stages of the life cycle? And I personally think that, if anything, partly because of the undue weight of Heckman's work on his preschool provision in the US, there is an assumption now that early years equals maximum impact. And I'm not sure that that is necessarily the case. In fact, sometimes, given that government actions are imperfect, you think it's better to address the problem when it presents itself rather than trying to predict 16 years in advance when the problem, who's going to have the problem. So there's quite a strong culture that early years must be the best place to intervene, which I think is worthy of being empirically tested. But if we had it's surprising how much of the social mobility debate is, as I say, informed by the 58 and 70 cohort study. And if you have ministers sitting around, it's not too far from the case, and saying we have X hundred millions of pounds to spend on improving social mobility, what's the best buy? The literature on that is very sparse indeed.
Richard?
Right. Richard Bartholomew from Government Social Research. It's probably a plea as much as a question, but just to register this interest. One of the big advances, I think, in the last 30 years or so in research on longitudinal data has been the ability to link population census, 1% sample of the population censuses, which now gives us a very powerful run of information. So we're able to analyse completely confidentiality, what's happened to a representative sample of the population in terms of very long-term trends by linking it with registration data on causes of death. And when I remember in the 1980s, the big and inclusive debate we had about the long-term health consequences of unemployment, it's now quite a revelation, I think my mic's not on, that actually we can show quite conclusively, and perhaps not surprisingly, that there are very long-term negative consequences. So in terms of the three parties, I wonder to what extent in government, given the questions about the future role and existence of the census, that research purpose of census data, that the usefulness, particularly when we look at long-term trends, is recognised, and the three parties, will you press colleagues on recognise their interest when the decisions are made about funding of the 2021 and future census?
Okay, I mean, we are there. I mean, we will be and are already very influenced by Andrew Dilmont's work in this area for us about advising on all these issues. We are trying to improve the linking administrative data. And down the track goes a question whether you can there's got so much administrative data that you could harness so much better that the conventional census proves to be unnecessary, or whether you use your administrative data linking to complement the continuing programme of the conventional census and and for that we need expert advice, not just from Andrew, but notably from Andrew. But you're right, and of course just knowing the kind of locational data, where people are, their addresses, and that is incredibly important for a lot of these things. that's certainly something that needs to be, and the links out of the census are one of the crucial ways in which we can keep that geographical data and still have more frequent and innovative uses of census-related data as the years pass.
No, we don't have any more time, I'm afraid. Polly Toynbee is going to kind of reflect on what's been going on. But thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much.